Bishop James Pike was one of the most controversial and paradoxical clergymen of our century. He was a lawyer turned priest, a Roman Catholic turned Episcopalian. He drew thousands into the church, yet was almost thrown out as a heretic. Some called him genius. When he went to mediums and seances, however, they called him mad. At last, he faced his destiny alone in the wilderness. His personal quest was for the answer to man's oldest mystery. In September of 1969, after James Pike resigned as Bishop of the Episcopal Church, he drove into the desolation of the Israeli desert with his new wife, Diane. It was here in 1948, in the caves of Qumran, that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. These parchments documented Hebrew law at the time of Jesus. Pike and his wife had come to explore these caves and experience the wilderness where Christ was tempted by Satan. Having followed an inaccurate map, they found themselves trapped in a riverbed far from the main road. They set out to seek help with only a bottle of soda and no protection from the 140-degree heat. The outspoken Pike had recently been banned from performing any priestly duties and had quit the church, hurt and angry. Was he here to retrace the steps of Christ, or had he in some way known he might die? Even in his youth, Pike's life centered on the church. As a child, he drew religious figures and dressed paper dolls as priests. A pious teenager whom others called a loner, he attended Roman Catholic Mass daily. He spent years doing special devotions to make sure that he would go to heaven. Priests took the place of the father he lost when he was 2. With them, he shared doubts he was already having about his faith, doubts that would always shadow him. His entire life was spent searching for meaning. As a youth, he left the Catholic Church and turned agnostic. After college, he began a promising legal career, but left it and became an Episcopal priest. It became a lifelong pattern. On the one hand, irresistibly drawn to the church, on the other, in conflict with it. Only 5 years out of divinity school, he was installed as dean of one of the largest cathedrals in the world, St. John the Divine in New York City. Pike brought new life to the vast cathedral and to the faith as well. He put traditional church theology into everyday language and used his powerful pulpit to voice his opinions on current issues. His opinions began to irritate church hierarchy. When the movie Baby Doll was called pornographic by Catholic Cardinal Spellman, Pike boldly went to see for himself. His attendance made news, and his sermon the following Sunday declared the movie profoundly Christian in message and less sensual than DeMille's movie The Ten Commandments. While some called Pike a publicity hound, others, like Archdeacon Darby Betts, understood his motives.
Bishop Pike had a great nose for news, and I'm convinced that his chief seeking of fame, notoriety, public attention, anything else you want to describe, was of course partly due to ego, but primarily due to his determination to be a preacher, to be an evangelist.
ABC television recognized his growing popularity and gave him his own weekly show. Now married for the second time, his wife and 4 children were often on the program. While he loved his family greatly, he had little time for them. He would later consider himself a failure as a father, partly perhaps because of his alcoholism, which took him years to conquer. Bishop Paul Moore of New York knew the driven clergyman for over 20 years.
I think the first thing I'd say about Jim Pike as a person to meet for the first time was an enormous energy, intellectual energy, physical energy. It was very hard for him to sit still. When he was talking, he was always using his hands and his arms, and his mind was going a mile a minute, and usually going faster than his words, so that you had a sense he was always trying to catch up with his thinking.
Pike was so compelled to achieve that he didn't consider his workday over until nearly midnight. He authored 20 books, including one entitled The Next Day, which he had to compile in 24 hours to meet a forgotten deadline. He traveled in the Holy Land to examine the Palestinian problem. Panels, articles, crusades. He missed few opportunities to capture public attention, endangering his health and his marriage. Why was he never satisfied? What was he trying to prove to the world, to the church, or to himself?
Some say Jim was a genius, and some say he was mad. I think that genius is very close to madness, and in Jim Pike's case, I think most of the time genius was being expressed. But the madness did come through. The madness came through in lack of control, in going far beyond the limits of normal human endurance in his use of himself and his expectations of others.
In 1958, Pike became Bishop of California, a position he had desperately wanted. The office had drawbacks, however. Now he would be expected to defend church orthodoxy, even if he disagreed with it, and disagree with it he did. In tune with the rebellious spirit of the 60s, he seemed to voice the unspoken doubts of millions about such once unquestionable doctrine as the virginity of Mary and the deity of Christ. And not only did he challenge the church, but he became more and more politically outspoken.
This sounds very unpatriotic, because the communist countries were on the side of God, whereas our nation was on the side of the devil, and it lost. Hooray!
He marched in Selma with Martin Luther King and said that he was quite ready for mayhem and death. He protested the war in Vietnam and proudly displayed his new Peace Cross. He established a street ministry in San Francisco to fight prejudice and help runaways, dropouts, and gays. He embraced each new project with unbounded enthusiasm. When Pike added new stained glass windows to Grace Cathedral, he chose to honor not biblical figures, but scientist Albert Einstein and astronaut John Glenn, personal heroes whom he called secular saints. In many ways, Pike was as wide-eyed and unrestrained as the flower children who populated Haight-Ashbury.
The remembrance of him that means most to me was his almost being a little boy as well as a great man. He was not only naive, he was not only humble, but he was starry-eyed about so many things. He was so vulnerable.